We all know to some extent that this is true. The West has fallen from its once not-so-distant glory. A mighty empire the West was, growing in exponential power for millennia. The states within the regions we call the West may have waged constant bloody wars against one another, but they stood united in Christ and Christianity always. Most of the world's greatest inventions sprang from the minds of Western men, and it boasts a significant number of the greatest philosophers too. So dominant was the West that it seemed to seize the world with its exploration and adventure, and so too did the languages of English and Spanish conquer. This begs the question, how did this mighty force begin to decay in today's modern times? The religious among us blame other religions for certain decays in society, but mostly in the West's least ways. The religious condemn the atheistic and non-religious for their degradation of the sacred pillar of life. The non-religious many actively accuse the religious for their outdated rules, morals, and laws, and note that it is between adversarial religions that most wars are sparked. Liberals believe that the West's fault lie in the clutches of fascism and the growing violent far right, while conservatives point their fingers at the liberals and their wanton poisoning of religion, tradition, family, and values. Others, not quite captured by either side or straddling the middle, acknowledge and concede points from both political spectrums, or take no side at all, wishing to distance themselves from the reckless tempest that is modern politics. However, there is no distance one can travel and no hole one can hide in that will save them from the torrents of politics. Politics will always find you and bring the taxman with it. Where did it go wrong? From looking at history, perhaps the best guess would lie before World War II or even prior to World War I. It was the World Wars that made it clear just how interconnected the world was, and how global conflicts would become something of a norm, given the new and tremendous military capabilities of the global superpowers. With great military power came great overreach, and all superpowers reached indeed, stretching their tentacles as far as they could. When their reach was insufficient, they would simply grow more limbs like a hydra would its heads, and seize more territory and influence. For some decades now, the political scene had been rocky and growing more extreme, the philosophies of Marxism, communism, Bolshevism, Leninism, and fascism taking root in the early 20th century and sacrificing tens of millions, if not hundreds of millions, to their political causes collectively. Let it be noted that the bloodshed from the political ideas of men in this age far outweighed that of the deaths of both World War I and II combined. Never before in history had death been so rife, had bodies piled up at the hands of other humans. Gone were the days when nations would simply trade with one another, importing what they lacked and exporting their excesses or lucrative goods. The era of global finance machine had dawned around the time of the 20th century, where every nation's economies were tangled into an invisible web of paper trails. Once entered into the current of global finance, it was impossible to break free from the stranglehold. The Great Depression was the first proof of this fact, the disaster hitting all corners of the world. With the fusion of all nations came a great flood of information. Like a great eye appeared above the world, Big Brother watching all. Once obscure parts of the world became the subjects of scrutiny, a magnifying glass over every wrongdoing, scandal, and humanitarian crime. Something happened that had never happened or occurred in human history before. Humans became constantly conscious of what was happening beyond their community, their country, and even their neighboring nations. The old world order was crumbling, the pillars cracking under the weight of available information and the spread of new ideas, wild or mundane. Very quickly, the 1950s went from a post-war suburban paradise where men worked for fair pay, women tended to the home and the children grew up with mothers who loved them and fathers who disciplined them, and nearly everything was affordable. In this time in the West, Christianity was inseparable from the home and everyday life. The law was enforced and morality was objective. In the midst of the most prosperous society ever conceived by man, men relaxed, surrounded by the safety of the society they built. Weakness slithered into men's lives like a serpent, their guard down after World War II had ended, and the illusion of safety had ripened in their minds. Women grew bold in their masculine counterparts' agreeableness, taking the chance to seize control, a perfect analogy to the fall of Adam and Eve. The change was as sudden as it was drastic. An extreme shift from the family-oriented way of life, the sexual revolution began in the late 1950s. With the fiery rise of the birth control pill and modern contraception, men and women increasingly became promiscuous, the Solomons and Jezebels of modern times. The purpose of intercourse, that being unity and procreation between a man and a woman, husband and wife, had been stripped of procreation and arguably unity as well, as a physical elastic barrier stood between the men and women involved. The loss of consequence drew many to their lusts. Some of this debauchery could be attributed to the weakness of men at this time, to their inattentiveness to religion and discipline within their safe society and their households, their hardships believed to be over. It was also likely due to the influx of ideas and the ease of attaining and transmitting information. Further still, the widespread adoption of the television into nearly half of Western homes by 1955 meant the governments of the West had a new, improved mode of propaganda. Almost simultaneously with the sexual revolution came second-wave feminism, where the ideas of workplace equality, reproductive rights, and challenging gender roles were championed. These ideas caught like wildfire, and the baby boomers shaped Western civilization as we know it today. Uber-capitalists in the government of the West recognized these movements as an opportunity to double the workforce, therefore expanding the economy to heights never dreamt of before. Thus, women were further encouraged to seek out liberation from men and to become a cog in the machine just like them. Never before in history had so many women come out to work, when before they were the homemakers. Because of this, children suffered, being raised by teachers at school or unrelated babysitters, spending less and less time with their parents. This simple fact made the nuclear family brittle, easy to snap. The days of a wife's subservience to her husband were over, or at least nearing their long and ancient tenure, which was once a simple fact of life for most of humanity. With the blending of men and women's attributes and duties, pressure was exerted upon Christianity to bend and change to the will of the many. The Catholic Church allowed some concessions in the 1960s with the Vatican II, encouraging social justice, relaxing the dress code to reflect with modern times, allowing Mass in local languages, which I wholeheartedly agree with, supported ecumenicalism, and more. However, the Catholic Church remained steadfast in the face of sexual revolution and affirmed that marriage was between a man and a woman and that marital acts are to be overseen strictly within the confines of marriage. The same steadfastness could not be said for some denominations of Christianity. Without a central authority, ancient doctrine, and deep-rooted traditions like Catholicism had, some Protestant branches were more prone to bending to the whims of society, their roots not quite as deep. With the introduction of no-fault divorce in 1969, the eternal union of husband and wife could be cut legally, severely undermining the moral teachings of Christianity. Divorce shattered families, children having to grow up in broken homes, becoming broken people. Many Protestant denominations accepted this social reality of divorce, as well as that of contraception and birth control, becoming living contradictions of their faith. The nail in the coffin for serious Christianity in the West occurred in 1973. The landmark Supreme Court decision in America, Roe v. Wade, legalized abortion, normalizing the degradation and termination of human life in the womb, changing what was once believed to be life at conception to life when I want it to be. Furthermore, in the year of our Lord, 1973, pornography was essentially legalized in the court case Miller v. California, allowing men and women to prostitute themselves for money for the pleasure of others who viewed it, plunging the sacred acts of marriage further into the abyss of sin, emptiness, and vacant meaning. At this point, music, movies, and media had been completely overridden by licentious postmodern activism, and gargantuan industries like Hollywood, record labels, universities, legacy news media, and all parts of the government propagated and encouraged the modern ideas that all desires needed to be pursued, morality was to be an opinion, not reality, the individual was a blank slate to be shaped and formed as one wished, and outdated tradition was to be questioned or phased out completely. Where once Republicans and Democrats were hand in hand with values, the importance of family, religious importance, and patriotism only really disagreeing, for the most part, on the subjects of policy and governance, the social gap widened significantly. Both Republicans and Democrats in the USA shifted left, yes, but Democrats shifted more, their liberal ideology accepting any new idea that pushed back on tradition and the old way. Conservatives are not faultless, for they capitulated to liberal ideas, at best allowing them to consume young minds, and at worst adopting the destruction of tradition, values, truth, and morality themselves. Easily the largest flashpoint of this interconnected world was the internet, more specifically the introduction of the World Wide Web in 1989. More than ever before, anyone could discover information on other people, other nations, and current events. People increasingly ditched physical communities for online ones, and bubbles of isolation exploded digitally. The internet served as a cloak, allowing people to seek their deepest desires in private, as well as to hide the darker parts of themselves behind a screen. With this digital isolation, the nuclear family fractured further from 1,000 pieces to 1,000,000. With divorce rates entering the stratosphere, rising political tensions as the gap in ideologies expanded, women and men spending longer hours at work and less hours at home, children seeing their parents less to be raised by the state, the rapid loss of religion, people seeking refuge on the internet from their problems like digital hermits, and much more, it is a small wonder why the pillar of family had collapsed into ruin, thus taking society with it. For what is society if not a collection of families? The societal breakdown had been well underway for decades, nobody blameless in this relatively sudden shift of history. On top of this, other aspects of the West were under attack, the average Westerner surrounded on all sides by an ambush. Obesity rates were skyrocketing, and so were the diagnoses of autoimmune diseases. Autism too increased many-fold over, reaching alarming levels. Many people claim the rise in autism is attributed to better testing, but all available sources state that testing became modernized in 1987 with the DSM-3R. Further modernized in the late 90s with spectrum thinking, and even further modernized in 2013 with DSM-5. And even still, the autism rates advanced at ridiculous rates. There was no obfuscation, however, with obesity, as it was clear our food was being replaced with chemicals, preservatives, pesticides, and ultra-processed methods. The culprits of this lie largely with big tobacco, when in the 60s they eyed big food as their next great investment, seeing as tobacco use was being phased out. By the 80s, big tobacco had largely consumed big food, and they largely pioneered processed and ultra-processed foods to addict America, and by extension, the West, as they had done before with tobacco. Despite great leaps and bounds in Western medicine, it was evident for anyone who ventured to investigate that Americans were getting sicker than ever before, and the medicine was hardly helping. Even more insult to injury, Americans paid, and still pay, by far the most for healthcare than any other nation, including that of other Western nations. It can hardly be called healthcare when a trip to the hospital to give birth costs $30,000, a heart transplant costs hundreds of thousands or millions of dollars, and a trip in the ambulance is added to your invoice at the tune of $3,000 or more. Affordability was quickly becoming a dream, and to an increasing population, a nightmare. The middle class was disappearing, slowly but surely, and elite classes were drowning in wealth, corporations swelling with the bloat of cash. A permanent underclass was swelling in the form of immigrants, accepting lower pay. Since women had entered the offices and effectively doubled the workforce, inflation and equilibrium was reached at that point, and it became nigh impossible for a family to support itself on just one income. For anyone with their heads in the sand, the 2008 crash was a glaring symptom of the loss of affordability. With the collapse of mortgage-backed securities built upon a shaky foundation of subprime Swiss cheese mortgages, the middle class took a huge hit, and one that was structural, not temporary. Huge swaths of Westerners, not just Americans, lost their homes, their valuables, their savings, and never recovered from it. The 1% were mostly untouched, watching from their ivory towers as the peasants, laborers, and goyim toiled under the weight of a financial crisis. It would only get more expensive from here. If you look at statistics from the 2000s, you will see an America that had at least some ties between person to person. After 9/11 in 2001, American patriotism soared, and the vast majority were united in their patriotism and nationalism, although we now know so much more about that day and the endless wars in the Middle East that followed. But that is a topic for a different day. Regardless, America was united, although still within the throes of sinful revelry. Race relations seem to have vastly improved, at least since the 90s. However, in the 2010s, race relations dropped to a 20-year low under Obama's tenure, at least partially due to the sensationalizing of white-on-black crime, although the statistics of this came out to be obscenely low when compared to black-on-insert race here crime. Black Lives Matter was founded in 2013 after Trayvon Martin was killed, and this instance drove a wedge between the American public. Simultaneously, neoliberalism had captured the left-leaning Democrats, and the traditional Democrats were either too weak or unwilling to stop it, and the Republicans and conservatives hardly moved a foot to stop the influx of progressivism. In the USA, gay marriage was legalized in 2015, somewhere late to the party, as plenty of other Western nations had legalized it years earlier. Many conservatives thought this concession would placate the left, but as always, an inch was given and a mile was taken. The idea of transgenderism had been around for a long time, mostly likely popularized by Weimar Germany in the nook between the world wars, and after the legalization of gay marriage, the radical ideology became the aforementioned mile that was taken. Transgenderism became a hot-button issue on everyone's lips, and soon children were involved in the conversation. Parents, already indoctrinated into the reality-bending nonsense of changing one's biological sex, pushed their ideas upon their innocence. Children and young people found forums, chats, and posts about transgenderism and homosexuality, and were encouraged to join the disgraceful cause. As a personal anecdote, growing up in middle school and high school, I saw and knew plenty of peers that fell into this evil social trap, as teachers, peers, and internet friends and strangers normalized the wizardry of shaping their gender, sex, and sexuality. Pornography had entered most homes, over 90% of men and boys admitting to have watched it in their lives, and many on the regular. The realities of sex, gender, and sexuality had been warped, Satan's will slipping into the consciousness of boys and girls at young ages and sexualizing their minds, teaching them to sexualize themselves and others. Transgender porn was pushed slowly and quietly, this movement satiating the ever-growing hungers of porn-addicted youths that were predisposed to more extreme content. With parents who knew little of the internet, they allowed their children to surf the web unmonitored and unchecked, even allowing them to stare at screens for countless hours every single day. Boys played video games and consumed porn at frightening ages, while girls spent hours looking at plastic surgeried, photo-edited models, the ideas of body dysmorphia embedding into their minds. Both boys and girls spent countless hours on social media too, engaging in useless information, attention-grabbing short videos, hate comment threads and comment wars, and faux conversations with friends online. As I spoke of before, these new radical extreme ideas took root in the minds of the youth, and they were forever changed, almost no ties left to their already broken and fractured nuclear families. These youths associated with the others whose minds had been seized by degeneracy, androgyny, and progressivism, and selected to be the members of these new groups rather than associate with their communities, ethnicities, or nationalities. They called themselves the rebels, the oppressed, the victims. They took their keyboard warrior antics and brought them with them into real conversations, speaking to people without respect and common courtesy. It was a race to the bottom to see who could be the most oppressed, the most feminized, the most degenerate. In the wake of woke wrath, white people were an easy scapegoat because they were the majority population, were more well-off financially than other minority groups, and were painted as colonizers, conquerors, and slavers by our modern history. In the name of black activism and people of color activism, many white people joined in with the jeering and hate, forgoing their heritage for victim points and virtue signaling. Meanwhile, when white people spoke out against this racism, they were slammed, shut out, ignored. They were left behind as people of color were chosen for university spots, jobs, and other positions. Meritocracy had died in the name of victim maxing. Whites did little to nothing to combat this racism and caved to the left or ignored it. Enmity was now the norm. The left and the right were now so irredeemably different that nearly no threads tied them together anymore. Each looked at the other, and they saw an alien, a strange creature before them with strange beliefs. Vitriol and venom was at everyone's lips, internet or in person. The people stood divided, but the elites were united in two things: money and power. Richer and more powerful than ever, their might was too large to ignore for either side. So, the left and right did what they knew best: vote. Like two toddlers fighting over a toy, presidents changed hands from Democrat to Republican, midterm elections flipping the House and Senate nearly every 2 years. Yet little did they realize that the obligation of voting was that but a myth. America, and by that extension the West, had been degrading each year, whether liberal or conservative leaders held power. Neither political side really improved the lives of their constituents, each person's life becoming less affordable, less healthy, less mentally sound, more hateful. Vote for the lesser of two evils, both sides said. But truthfully, if these lesser of two evils are added up, it equals a greater evil, as we see in today's society. No amount of voting for someone who is better than the other one will change our lives. Settling for a somewhat better candidate reaps nothing but dust in the end. Such hate was harbored for Westerners that governments allowed millions upon millions of third world foreigners across our borders. This drastic flood of foreigners inundated our welfare systems, therefore raising our taxes, raised housing prices and goods, and sent our violent crime statistics into orbit. Even still, they increased the number of legal immigrants too. For years, as children, we were taught that the West, and by extension whites, were evil for propagating slavery, for conquering lands like Africa and the Americas, for waging religious wars during the Crusades against harmless Muslims, and that whites must atone for the sins of their ancestors. The West had earned their wealth with blood, and they must give back to the world what they've taken: security, money, and stability. The reality couldn't be further from the truth. Whites were among the last to adopt slavery, and were among the first to abolish it. The vast majority of nations and peoples throughout history practiced slavery, taking prisoners of war and selling them. And this included Africans selling captured African tribes to the Europeans during the transatlantic slave trade, as well as Native Americans brutally slaughtering and enslaving neighboring tribes, just to name a few of the more recent cases at the same time period. Conquering was by no means a white trade, for this is the simple reality of human history since the dawn of time. It was what strong societies did to other weaker societies, an unfortunate reality of humanity indeed. And as for the Muslims during the Crusades, Europe was plunged into a 400-year dark age, their coasts and lands raped, pillaged, and taken. Only after 400 years of torture did Europe stand united against Islam with Christ in their hearts and minds in order to save their home that they loved and to fight against the alien religion they knew not. That aside, much like the Muslims in the Dark Ages, many foreigners of many religions and colors now came in droves by boats and land crossings into Europe and Canada and the United States. Some of them worked and contributed, yes, but many, if not most, came for the benefits that Western nations provided them. These aliens came here to our home illegally, and our people sheltered them amongst us as some of them committed heinous crimes against our family, friends, neighbors. While we work and toil for increasingly less wages, many lurk and loiter in public spaces, unemployed, and come home to houses or hotels paid for by our dime to eat food taken out of our taxes and receive health care that is stripped from our wallets. While their entire lives are subsidized, many contributing little to our societies except for crime, refuse, and a replacement of our people. We pay for their existence on top of our already unaffordable existence. Great are their crimes of sloth and greed, but greater is the crime of our own countrymen and people selling us Westerners out to these foreigners, traitors against their own nations. Borders, the first defense of nations since history itself began, have now become an oppressive, hateful thing to the left. Everyone is welcome, they say, as those welcome to make our lives harder, and they provide little in return for our grace and kindness. They're human, the left says, as our foreigners kill our people and steal their innocence. Their disregard of human life is self-evident. For some unknown reason, it rests upon the West's shoulders to harbor the paupers of the world, who seek free goods and an easy lifestyle. Westerners are the only ones who are obligated to take on this great burden, as wealthy Asian, African, and South American nations are completely exempt from this responsibility. The truth is, the goal has always been to eradicate the West and their natives, for nihilism has rooted into the black hearts of our government, media, and leaders, regardless of political ideology. The only reasonable assumption is that the West has become suicidal and that Satan has been given the reins. All of this in combination has led to the decline and or the fall of the West as we know it. Is there a way out? As a collective, perhaps. Perhaps not. Empires fall as we know in history. As an individual, however, there are many prophylactic measures to hedge against the ruins of society. Start with religion, for this is the universal basic truth that all men must adhere to. I myself am a staunch Catholic, and I believe it to be the wholeness of the truth. But I also love and admire my Protestant, Christian, and Orthodox brothers. In a world of falsity and fraud, Christ stands alone as a light and truth to all willing to take it. And I encourage all non-believers to ask themselves this thought-provoking hypothetical. If God exists, and so too does Satan, who do you think has more influence in the minds of today's society? Which one would you stand with and embrace, if it were true? Second, I implore you to seek nuances in your beliefs and ideologies. Do not follow the party lines blindly. Come up with ideas of your own, explore them, research, and hold true to your convictions. It's okay to disagree with others, especially those who are your friends and family. If your convictions toe the party line completely, so be it. But at least do the due diligence of vetting these parties first. Trust in your ability to find things out for yourself and critically think. Don't believe everything you see on the internet. Lastly, spend more time with what matters. Friends, family, and productivity. Find your calling, your purpose in life, and pursue it. If you can't find it or don't know it, then seek it still. Many things are alright with moderation, but don't dive headfirst into video games, social media, TV, and the internet and expect to live a fulfilling, joyful life. These things are entertaining and important, yes, but they aren't real. Read a book for God's sake, and you'll instantly stand elevated over those ignorant many who don't. Not that reading makes you smarter or boosts your IQ, but if you read the right books on the right topics, you can and will ingest knowledge in a more efficient, and most times in a more accurate way than the news. It is easy to lose yourself in the world and in the news. Instead, live your life detached from things that don't directly affect you, and dial into things that are real, tangible, and present physically in your life. Talk to the friend you haven't seen in a while, hug your mother, pet a cat in the street. Take a moment to absorb the views of nature when you see them. Take care.